Imagine owning nothing. Not your clothes, not your bed, not even the ring on your own finger. In parts of medieval Europe, a bride's wedding ring, her gowns, her jewelry, all of it belonged, legally, to her husband. The moment the priest finished speaking, she could wear them. She could never sell them. She could never leave with them. In the eyes of the law, a married woman and her possessions were simply his, and before any of that happened, before the ring, before the priest, before the vows, there was a number, a price, written down, argued over, sometimes haggled the way you'd haggle over a good milking cow. Hi friends. Tonight, we're going somewhere quiet and a little heavy, but gently, softly, the way we always do here. We're going back to the world of medieval dowries. Contracts, price lists, and what happened to a woman when her husband died, and the number that once described her value suddenly needed to be recalculated all over again. So if you're ready, go ahead and dim the lights now. Pull that blanket up over your shoulders. Let your body sink into the mattress. You don't need to remember anything from tonight. You don't need to hold on to a single fact. Just let the story drift over you, the way mist drifts over a river at dawn, and let yourself rest. Let's start in a small stone house, somewhere in the countryside of 12th century France. Picture a low wooden table, a single candle, its flame leaning slightly in the draught from an ill-fitting door. Two men sitting across from each other, a father and the father of the young man his daughter is meant to marry. Between them, on the table, is a piece of parchment. It isn't a love letter. It isn't a poem. It's an inventory, 3 sheep. A length of woven wool cloth, dyed the deep red that took the most dye and the most money to make. 2 silver spoons, a small chest of linens, and, written at the bottom in a careful, cramped hand, a sum of coin, the last piece of the arrangement, meant to smooth over anything the goods didn't quite cover. This was the dowry. And it wasn't a gift, not really. It was payment. Payment from the bride's family to the groom's family, in exchange for a husband agreeing to take on the cost and the risk of a wife. You can almost hear the quiet of that room, the scratch of a quill, the soft clink of the 2 silver spoons being set on the table so the groom's father can turn them over in his hands, checking their weight, checking for dents. Outside, a dog barks once, then settles. Smoke curls up from the chimney into a cold star-scattered sky. And somewhere else in that same house, upstairs, behind a door, is the daughter herself. She is perhaps 15, perhaps 16. She is not in the room where her future is being decided. She may not even know the exact number that has just been agreed upon on her behalf. It's strange to think about now, isn't it, that a person's whole future could be settled in a room she wasn't invited into, over goods she'd probably spent years helping to spin, weave, and store. There's a dry little irony in that, if you think about it too long. She likely made some of the very cloth being used to purchase her own marriage. Now, dowries themselves weren't new, and they weren't unique to any one country. Almost every region of medieval Europe had some version of this system, though the details shifted depending on where you were and how wealthy the family happened to be. For a poor farming family, a dowry might be almost embarrassingly small. A few farm animals, a used cooking pot, a single wool blanket, maybe patched more than once. Even a small parcel of land, if the family had any spare at all, though land was so precious that most families guarded it fiercely, and only offered it when they had no other choice. For a noble family, the dowry could be almost unimaginable by comparison. Estates, titles, political alliances stitched directly into the marriage contract, so that the union bound not just 2 people, but 2 houses, 2 territories, sometimes 2 entire regions that had once been rivals. Picture, for a moment, 2 very different bedrooms on the same night, somewhere in the same kingdom. In one, a farmer's daughter lies awake under a thin blanket, listening to her parents murmur in the next room about whether they can spare the second-best goat. In the other, a noblewoman lies in a bed with carved wooden posts and heavy curtains, knowing that her marriage will hand over an entire parcel of contested farmland to a family her own father fought a border dispute with only 6 years earlier, different scale. Same quiet ache in its own way, because in both rooms, that night, A young woman is falling asleep inside a decision that was never fully hers. Let's slow down here and talk about what these contracts actually looked like, because the detail is oddly soothing in its own way, the way old paperwork so often is. Careful, specific, almost soft in how thoroughly it tried to account for every possibility. A dowry contract from a merchant family in 14th century Italy might list, item by item, 1 feather mattress, 2 wool blankets, a set of pewter dishes, 12 in total, a dowry chest, the cassone, as it was sometimes called, carved with painted scenes, often depicting virtues like obedience or chastity, gazing out at the very bride who would spend her married life keeping her linens folded inside it. Some contracts even specified the exact coin to be used, gold florins, silver marks, because currency wasn't standardized the way it is now, and a family wanted to be certain. They weren't quietly shortchanged by an unfamiliar coin from another town. And tucked into many of these contracts was a clause that mattered more than almost anything else in the whole document. What happens to the dowry if the husband dies first? This one clause, small, dry, legal, was, in its own quiet way, one of the only forms of protection a medieval woman had. It's almost touching, in a bittersweet sort of way, how much of a woman's future security rested on a few careful lines of ink agreed upon before she'd even met the man she'd share a home with. Because, here's the truth of it, a widow's dowry, assuming the contract had been written carefully, and assuming her husband's family didn't try to cheat her out of it, which did happen, was sometimes the only thing standing between her and complete ruin. Picture a woman in her 30s, a husband of 15 years, now lying still under a plain wooden cross in the churchyard. 3 children, maybe 4, gathered close around her skirts, cold and frightened, and not fully understanding yet what has changed. She has no income of her own. In most places, she couldn't simply take up her husband's trade, his land, his position in the town guild. What she could do, what the law was, at least in theory, built to allow, was reclaim her dowry. The goods, or their value in coin, that had come with her into the marriage all those years ago. It sounds almost fair, doesn't it? On paper. A kind of quiet insurance policy, sewn into the fabric of the marriage from the very beginning. But in practice, it rarely unfolded so cleanly. Her husband's brothers might insist the dowry had already been spent. On debts, on the farm, on a bad harvest 3 winters back. Her in-laws might delay and delay again, hoping she'd simply give up or remarry quickly, or quietly disappear into some corner of the household as an unpaid caretaker for the children who were, after all, theirs too, by blood if not by law. Some widows spent years, actual years, in local courts, arguing over 3 sheep and a wool blanket that had been listed in careful ink on a contract written before they were even old enough to understand what it meant. There's something almost peaceful in imagining her, though, isn't there? Sitting very still on a wooden bench outside a manor court, waiting for her name to be called, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders against the cold morning air, patient in the particular way only someone who has already survived the worst of it can be patient. She had already buried a husband. A court delay was, by comparison, something she knew, deep down, how to simply wait out. And waiting, it turns out, was something medieval widows became remarkably good at. Because widowhood came with its own strange, quiet rulebook, one that shifted again depending on where in Europe you happened to live, and how old you happened to be when it happened. In some regions, a widow gained more freedom than she'd ever had as either a daughter or a wife. She could run a household on her own, manage a small workshop, sign her own contracts, for the very first time in her life, without needing a father's or husband's permission, trailing behind every signature. In other regions, the moment felt less like freedom and more like being quietly handed off. To a brother-in-law, to a grown son, to whichever male relative the local custom decided was now responsible for managing her and her dowry on her behalf. There was one part of a widow's situation, though, that even the neighbors tended to whisper about, low and careful, over garden fences and market stalls. Something that had almost nothing to do with money at all, and everything to do with what was expected of her body and her heart. in the months that followed a husband's death, what the neighbors whispered about in those first weeks after a husband's burial had almost nothing to do with grief itself. It had to do with time, because in many parts of medieval Europe, a widow was expected to observe a mourning period, sometimes a full year, sometimes less, depending on the region and her age, before she could even think about remarrying. And the strange, quiet cruelty of it was this: the very same neighbors who murmured disapproval if she remarried too quickly were often the same ones who murmured disapproval if she waited too long, too fast, and she was cold-hearted, already scheming for a new husband before her old one's grave had settled. Too slow, and she was foolish, letting a farm sit untended, letting a dowry sit idle, when any sensible woman would have secured her family's future already. There was no version of grief that satisfied everyone. There rarely is, even now. You can picture her, can't you? Standing at her own gate in a plain dark gown, nodding politely to a neighbor woman who has just asked, with syrupy concern, whether she's given any thought yet to who might help her with the harvest this year. The question sounds kind. It rarely was, entirely. Let's rest here a moment in the softness of an ordinary widow's ordinary week, because it's gentler than it sounds. Picture a small farmhouse in rural England, perhaps a year after we last saw our widow at the manor court. The dowry dispute, let's imagine, has finally settled, not entirely in her favor, but enough. She has her 2 wool blankets back, her pewter dishes, a small sum of coin that will stretch, if she's careful, through the winter. She wakes before dawn, the way she always has, and pulls a shawl around her shoulders against the chill, still clinging to the room. Downstairs, the fire has gone to embers overnight, and she coaxes it back to life slowly, feeding it thin strips of kindling, watching the small orange glow spread and catch. Outside, a rooster calls once into the gray morning. A dog somewhere down the lane answers with a single half-hearted bark, then falls quiet again. She has 4 children now to feed, clothe, and somehow keep believing that the world is still, on the whole, a safe and steady place. The eldest, a boy of 11, has taken to helping with the heavier farm work. Not because anyone forced him to, but because he'd watched his mother carry water alone one too many times, and something in him had simply decided, without much fuss, that this wasn't right. There's something quietly moving about that, isn't there? A boy, barely past childhood himself, stepping in without complaint into the gap his father's death left behind. Remarriage, when it came, wasn't always about love, though sometimes, gently, it was. More often, it was a kind of practical rescue. A second husband meant another set of hands for the farm, another income for the household, another adult in the house to share the endless, grinding weight of simply staying alive through a medieval winter. But remarriage complicated the dowry all over again, in ways that could tangle a family's finances for years. Because if a widow remarried, her dowry, the very same goods and coin that had once secured her first marriage, often needed to be folded into her new one. Sometimes her first husband's family fought to keep a portion of it, arguing it belonged, morally if not strictly legally, to their side of things, since it was their household it had originally supported. Sometimes her new husband's family wanted the whole of it transferred over immediately, eager for the extra security it brought to their name. And sometimes, quietly, in the middle of all this legal tug-of-war, the widow herself simply lost track of what, exactly, she still owned. Which spoons were hers? Which blanket had come from which marriage? Whether the small parcel of land near the eastern hedge was truly hers to pass down to her children, or whether it had, in some clause she barely remembered signing, already been promised elsewhere. It's a strange kind of exhaustion to imagine. Not just grief, not just labor, but the slow, papery exhaustion of never quite being certain what belonged to you. Let's drift now to a different kind of household altogether, a noble one, in 15th century Burgundy, where the stakes of a widow's remarriage climbed far higher than spoons and blankets. Here, a widow's dowry might include an entire castle, a stretch of farmland large enough to house a dozen tenant families. Political alliances that had been carefully, deliberately built into her first marriage contract binding two noble houses together in a fragile, mutually convenient peace. When her husband died, that peace didn't simply continue on its own. It needed very quickly to be either preserved or replaced. Picture the great hall of that castle, candlelit and cavernous, the ceiling lost somewhere in shadow above. The widow, perhaps in her late 20s, dressed in the deep, unadorned black that noble mourning required, sits at the head of a long table, flanked by advisors, priests, and distant male relatives, all of them murmuring quietly about what should happen next. Should she remarry within her late husband's family to keep the alliance intact? Should her hand be offered elsewhere to forge an entirely new peace with a different, perhaps more useful, neighboring house? Should her young son, if she had one, simply be raised under a regent's guidance until he was old enough to inherit everything himself, leaving her, in the meantime, oddly powerful and oddly powerless all at once? There's a strange, quiet drama to imagining her in that candlelit hall, the only person in the room who has actually lost a husband, and yet, in some ways, the person whose feelings on the matter carried the least official weight. And there was one particular clause, buried deep in many of these noble marriage contracts, that decided almost everything about what happened next. A clause so specific, so carefully worded, that entire wars had, on rare occasions, been quietly avoided or quietly triggered by a single line of it. That clause was called, in most legal Latin of the period, the reversion clause, though ordinary people, if they spoke of it at all, simply called it what comes back. In plain terms, it decided this: if a marriage produced no living children, did the wife's dowry, her lands, her goods, her carefully negotiated wealth, return to her own family upon her husband's death? Or did it stay, permanently, with her husband's family, folded forever into their estate, regardless of what became of her? The answer changed everything for a widow without children. If the reversion clause favored her, she might return to her father's house, or her brother's, if her father too had passed. With her original dowry largely intact, a woman restored, in a sense, to where she'd started, only older, and considerably more experienced in the particular sorrows of the world. If the clause did not favor her, she might find herself, quite suddenly, with almost nothing, a widow, childless, dowry, absorbed entirely into a household that no longer had any real obligation to keep her. Picture her, in that second version of events, packing a single small trunk in a cold upstairs bedroom, folding away the very gowns and linens that had once been listed, item by item, on the same contract that had brought her into this house in the first place. Only now she is folding them to leave, not to arrive. Where would she go in a situation like that? A convent sometimes, not always out of faith, but out of simple practicality, since a convent could offer food, shelter, and a small measure of quiet dignity to a woman who had nowhere else the law required to take her in. A distant relative's household, sometimes, taken in as an unpaid companion or caretaker, her presence tolerated more than welcomed, and sometimes, if she was lucky, a friend. Another widow, perhaps, who understood, without needing to be told, exactly what this particular kind of quiet loss felt like. Let's slow the pace even further here, and rest for a moment on something gentler. Because for every widow who lost everything, there was another who found, quite unexpectedly, a kind of freedom she'd never known before. In certain merchant towns, particularly in parts of the Low Countries and northern Germany, a widow who inherited her husband's trade could, under the right circumstances, run his workshop herself. Not as a figurehead, not with a male relative's name quietly attached above hers on the guild rolls. Genuinely, actually, in her own right. Picture her now, this different widow, standing in a small weaver's workshop, lit by pale morning light through a row of narrow windows. Her hands move automatically over the loom, threading, checking tension, the rhythm of it as familiar to her by now as breathing. She has run this workshop for 3 years, since her husband's death. She knows the trade better, if she's honest with herself, than he ever did. Apprentices still call her mistress, the same title they might once have used for her husband, and she has learned not to flinch at how strange that felt, the first few times she heard it. There is a particular kind of quiet pride in this, not loud, not celebrated, rarely written about in any grand history, but real all the same. A woman alone, keeping a household and a livelihood standing on her own 2 feet, in a century that gave her almost no legal reason to expect she'd ever be allowed to, still tired, still capable, still somehow entirely her own, but even a widow as capable as was this lived under the shadow of one final, quiet danger. Something that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with how easily a woman's hard-won independence could be undone by a single accusation, a single rumor, a single jealous neighbor with nothing better to do than talk. It rarely took much. A comment about how quickly she'd taken over her husband's ledgers. A rumor that she'd been seen speaking too long, too easily, with a merchant passing through town. A jealous rival weaver, perhaps, who found it easier to whisper about a woman's character than to compete with the quality of her cloth. An independent widow, one who ran her own workshop, kept her own accounts, answered to no husband and no father. Unsettled people, in a quiet way that they didn't always examine too closely. And when people are unsettled, they often reach, without quite meaning to, for the nearest convenient explanation. Sometimes that explanation had a name: witchcraft, immorality, unnatural pride. Sometimes it was simply enough to say a woman was too independent for her own good, and let the town's imagination do the rest. Our weaver, the one we left standing at her loom, mistress in her own right, never faced anything so severe as a formal accusation. Let's let her keep that peace gently in our story. But other women in other towns weren't so fortunate, and their independence, hard-won and quietly proud, could be undone by nothing sturdier than gossip carried across a well on a slow afternoon. Hi again, friends, if you've drifted in and out since we began. That's all right. There's nothing here you need to catch. Just let your eyes soften. Let your shoulders sink a little further into the pillow, and let the story keep moving gently around you. Let's turn now to something quieter still, and in its own way, stranger. What happened when a marriage itself, rather than simply a husband, came undone? Because dowries didn't only return upon death. Sometimes they returned upon annulment, and annulment, in the medieval church's eyes, was an entirely different sort of unraveling. Divorce, as we understand it now, essentially didn't exist. But annulment did. The church's declaration that a marriage had, in some technical sense, never been valid in the first place. Perhaps the couple were too closely related by blood, a relation sometimes traced back with almost absurd precision through distant cousins and half-forgotten family trees. Perhaps one party had been married before, in secret, to someone else entirely. Perhaps, and this one shows up more often in the old church records than you might expect, the marriage had simply never been consummated. Picture a quiet ecclesiastical court, somewhere in 13th century northern France, wooden benches, a high narrow window letting in a single shaft of pale daylight, a clerk in the corner, dipping his quill again and again into a small pot of ink, recording testimony in careful Latin. A young wife sits with her hands folded in her lap, answering questions from a robed church official with a patience that has clearly cost her something to maintain. Her husband sits several feet away, not quite looking at her. Neither of them wanted this marriage undone out of spite. Particularly, more likely, some flaw in the original arrangement had simply come quietly, slowly, to light. A forgotten family connection, a prior betrothal neither family had properly disclosed, and underneath all of it, humming along in the background of every question and every answer, was the same practical concern that had shaped the marriage in the first place. What happens to the dowry now? If a marriage was annulled, the dowry, in most cases, returned to the wife's family, the same way it might upon a husband's death, though often with far messier feelings tangled around the return. Because unlike a widow's grief, which at least came with a certain social sympathy attached to it, an annulled wife sometimes carried a quieter, heavier kind of shame, whether or not any fault could reasonably be laid at her feet. Neighbors whispered differently about an annulled woman than they did about a widow. A widow had simply lost something through misfortune. An annulled woman in the unfair arithmetic of small-town gossip was sometimes treated as though she herself had been found lacking in some way, too closely related to her husband by an accident of birth she had no control over, too slow to conceive a child, too something, in the vague, unkind shorthand of people who enjoyed having someone to talk about. It's a strange, sad little irony, isn't it? That a woman who had done nothing wrong at all could still come home from that quiet church court feeling as though she'd failed some invisible test. Picture her now, walking back from that court through a narrow cobbled lane, her dowry chest, reclaimed, its contents largely intact, being carried behind her by two of her father's servants. She should feel relief, and in a distant way she probably does. But mostly, in this particular moment, she just feels tired. Tired the way you feel after holding your composure through something difficult. Long after the difficult part is actually over, there's a soft comfort, though, in picturing what came after that walk. A warm, familiar house waiting for her. A mother who asks no questions yet, only puts a bowl of something warm in front of her, and lets her eat in peace before either of them says another word. Let's rest here a while in something gentler, because dowry law wasn't only ever a story of loss. It was, in its slow and imperfect way, also one of the earliest forms of financial protection a woman in medieval Europe could count on. Flawed, unevenly applied, sometimes ignored outright by families who simply decided the law wasn't worth the trouble of honoring. But present all the same, in a period of history that gave women astonishingly few guarantees of any kind. In parts of medieval Spain, for instance, a wife's dowry was considered legally separate from her husband's own property throughout the marriage, meaning that if he ran up gambling debts, or made a disastrous trade deal, or simply mismanaged the family's money, her dowry, in principle, couldn't be touched by his creditors. It remained hers, quietly waiting, protected on paper if not always in practice. In parts of medieval Italy, some cities kept public dowry registries, actual civic records, listing what a woman had brought into her marriage, so that if a dispute ever arose later, there was an official document to point to, rather than simply one family's word against another's fading memory. Imagine, for a moment, a city clerk in 15th century Florence, bent over one of these enormous leather-bound ledgers, dipping his pen, recording line by line, bride's name, groom's name, the goods and coin exchanged, the date, row after row after row of ordinary marriages, each one a small, careful attempt to protect a woman's future against the countless ways it might otherwise quietly slip away from her. There's something almost tender about that image, a room full of clerks, hunched over candlelight, doing the slow, unglamorous work of trying to make fairness a little more possible, one recorded dowry at a time, and yet for every careful clerk and every protective clause, there were just as many quiet workarounds, clever, sometimes almost admirable in their creativity, through which husbands and their families found ways around the law's intentions. A husband might claim he'd invested his wife's dowry in a family business, one that had since, conveniently, failed. A father-in-law might insist that certain goods listed in the original contract had actually been intended as a gift, not a dowry, and therefore weren't subject to return under any circumstance. A husband's brothers, after his death, might simply delay a widow's claim for so many years, through so many small legal technicalities, that she eventually settled for far less than she was owed, simply out of sheer exhaustion. It's worth pausing here, gently, to notice something almost funny in a dry, weary sort of way. How remarkably creative people in every century have been when it comes to avoiding paying what they owe. 800 years separate us from these disputes, and somehow the excuses haven't changed nearly as much as you'd think. Let's drift now towards something a little softer still, something closer to daily texture than to law. Because underneath all these contracts and clauses and courtrooms was an ordinary woman's ordinary week, filled with small, tangible tasks that had nothing to do with any of this at all. Picture her, any one of the women we've met tonight, widow or bride, noble or peasant, rising before the light, tending a fire, drawing water from a well shared by 11 other households, kneading bread with hands that never seemed to fully lose the cold of the morning air. Picture her spinning wool by firelight in the evenings, the soft, rhythmic click of the spindle, turning, 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 while somewhere outside an owl calls once, twice into the dark. These were the hours that made up the actual texture of a life. Far more of them, by simple volume, than any single court appearance or dowry negotiation. The law shaped the edges of her world, but the fire, the water, the wool, the bread, these were the world itself, quiet and repetitive, and in their own tired way, oddly comforting, still tired, still spinning, still somehow keeping the whole small world of her household turning along with it. But there was one more piece of this story left to tell. The quietest, and in some ways the most human, the story of what a woman herself was permitted to say, if anything at all, about her own dowry, her own marriage, her own fate. When no one in the room had thought to ask her, the honest answer, most of the time, was very little. Sometimes nothing at all. A daughter might be consulted, gently, in the way you might consult a child about which chore they'd prefer to do. The outcome already decided, the asking more a formality than a genuine choice. In some places and in some families, particularly among the wealthy, canon law technically required a woman's consent before a marriage could be considered valid. She had to say some version of yes, out loud, in front of witnesses, but consent given under the quiet, constant pressure of a father's expectations, a family's finances, and an entire social world that offered almost no other path forward for an unmarried woman. Well, it's worth sitting with, gently, what consent really meant in circumstances like that. Picture a young woman standing before a priest on her wedding day, dressed in whatever finery her family could manage, her dowry already recorded weeks earlier in careful ink. The priest asks her, formally, whether she agrees to this marriage. And she says yes, because what, really, would saying anything else have looked like? Where would that no have taken her? Back to a father's house that had already spent months, sometimes years, arranging this exact outcome. Into a kind of social limbo that had no comfortable place prepared for her at all. Hi again, friends. If you've been drifting in and out, we're near the end now. Let your body settle even further into the mattress. There's nothing left to remember from tonight. Just let the last of this story wash over you, soft and slow, like the final ripples after a stone has long since sunk beneath the water. And yet, here and there quietly, in the margins of the old records, you do find traces of women who found small ways to shape their own fates, even within a system that offered them so little room to do so. A merchant's daughter in Bruges who delayed her own wedding by nearly 2 years, citing one polite excuse after another, until the match her father had originally arranged simply fell apart on its own, leaving her free to marry a man of her own quiet choosing instead. A widow in rural Castile who, rather than remarry as her in-laws expected, used her returned dowry to buy a small flock of sheep and simply built a modest, independent life of her own, never wealthy, never celebrated, but entirely stubbornly hers. A young bride in Flanders who negotiated, through her mother, a specific clause in her own marriage contract, one guaranteeing her the right to continue practicing her needlework trade after marriage, keeping any income from it entirely separate from her husband's control. These weren't grand rebellions. No one wrote songs about them. They were small, practical, quietly determined choices, made by women working within the narrow space the world had left them. Space that was almost never generous, but occasionally, if you looked closely enough, wasn't quite as airless as it first appeared. There's a gentle comfort in that, isn't there? Even inside a system built almost entirely around treating a woman's future as a transaction to be recorded in ink and coin, some women still found their own small, quiet ways of writing themselves into the story a little more fully. Let's come back now, gently, to where we began tonight. Remember that small stone house, the candle leaning in its draught, the 2 fathers bent over a piece of parchment, listing sheep and silver spoons and lengths of red-dyed cloth. Remember the daughter upstairs, behind a closed door, not yet knowing the exact shape of the future being decided for her. Let's imagine, just for a moment, a little further forward in her story than we did before. She marries. Years pass, the way they always do, quietly and all at once. She raises children of her own, teaches her daughters to spin, to weave, to fold linens carefully into a chest not so different from the one that once carried her own dowry into this house. Perhaps, one day, she becomes a widow herself, sitting patiently on a bench outside a manor court, waiting for her own name to be called. The shape of her life was never entirely her own to choose. But within that shape, narrow as it sometimes was, she still lived, still laughed, probably, at some small joke shared over the washing, still felt the particular, ordinary comfort of a warm fire on a cold night. The same comfort you're feeling right now, wrapped in your own blanket, in your own quiet room, 800 years and an entire world away from her. Somewhere in that gap of centuries, something has changed enormously. And yet something else, quieter and harder to name, hasn't changed nearly as much as you might expect. The simple, universal comfort of coming home, tired, to a warm hearth and a place that is, in whatever small way the world allows, entirely your own. That's where we'll leave her tonight, and where we'll leave you too, warm, settled, and drifting. If this story kept you company tonight, you're welcome to like or subscribe, so more of these quiet histories can find their way to you when you need them. But only if it felt worth it. There's no pressure here, not tonight, not ever, just a gentle door left open, in case you'd like to come back. For now, though, let everything else go. The sheep, the silver spoons, the parchment, the courts, the quiet women who lived and lost and occasionally, stubbornly, found small ways to keep something of their own. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders soften into the mattress beneath you. Let the room around you grow quiet and dim and safe. You're warm, you're held, you're home. And it's time now to rest.